Thanks everyone for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behavioral Science and Policy Association. This is our third webinar of this academic year. My name is Patrick Rooney, and I'm a second-year PhD in strategy at Rotman, a BEAR research coordinator and the moderator for today's webinar. Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman, or BEAR, is a research center at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, whose three programmatic missions are to research, educate, and engage in meaningful outreach with our academic, governmental, and industry partners. These monthly webinars are our way to hear firsthand from academics and practitioners who are making a meaningful impact in the world of behavioral insights, in particular behaviorally informed business and evidence-based public policy. We're delighted today to have Professor Sonia Kang, Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior from the University of Toronto. Before I introduce Sonia, I would like to go over the ground rules for this webinar. Following this introduction, our speaker will deliver a 35-minute presentation. During the presentation, please submit questions for our speaker by clicking the Chat tab at the top right of your WebEx screen and typing into the entry box. These questions will be visible to all of the participants. At the end of the talk, and with time permitting, we will have a question and answer session in which I will select questions from the Chat tab to ask our speaker. As a side note, please only use the Q&A tab for WebEx connectivity issues. And these questions will be sent privately to Liz Kang, who is our WebEx technical guru. With that out of the way, without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing Sonia Kang. Sonia Kang is an Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior and Human Resource Management in the Department of Management at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and holds a cross-appointment to the Organizational Behavior and HR Management area at Rotman. Her research explores the challenges and opportunities of diversity, including strategies for mitigating the far-reaching effects of stigma and harnessing the power of diversity for society and organizations alike. Sonia's research has been published in journals including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Psychological Science, Administrative Science Quarterly, and the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, and has been featured in media outlets such as The Globe and Mail and The Atlantic. Thanks, Sonia, for being here today, and take it away.
All right, thanks, Patrick. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning into the webinar. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to tell you about some of my research on diversity. And even though the webinar format makes this a little bit more challenging, I'm still hoping that we'll be able to engage during the Q&A and talk about how we can translate a lot of these discussions that we have about diversity into real actions. So today I'll specifically focus in on diversity in hiring, and hopefully it'll help us to start thinking about how changes that we make at this first stage about where we hire, how we hire, can really scale up and then permeate throughout the organization into all of our diversity and inclusion related practices. So over the next hour or so, I'll give you a very short overview of background research on diversity training and initiatives. I'll tell you about some of my own work on diversity statements, which is the formal language about diversity and inclusion that you often see on company websites and in job advertisements. I'll talk about what these diversity statements mean for a company's hiring practices and about how the diversity statements can impact applicants themselves, sometimes negatively. Then I'll turn to some specific recommendations informed by behavioral science on how we can start experimenting to really try to improve the situation and move closer to that goal of diversity. So the very quick summary of background research is the title of this slide: Discrimination is a Problem in Hiring. And maybe a better summary is that discrimination is still a problem in hiring today in 2017. And really despite decades of efforts that have been aimed at increasing representation of disadvantaged groups, discrimination still exists. A really powerful demonstration of this, I think, comes from research by Marianne Bertrand and Sendil Mullainathan, which shows that resumes with minority racial cues like Black or Asian names get 30 to 50% fewer callbacks for interviews than otherwise completely equivalent resumes. So If you were to send out a resume with a name on it like Tyrone or Jada or Wei or Ming, it would be 30 to 50% less likely to get a callback than a completely equivalent resume with the name Emily or Jennifer or Scott or Adam. So this is an effect that was first shown in the US, but it's also been shown here in Canada by Phil Oriopoulos and his colleagues right here at the University of Toronto. The type of callback discrimination that I just told you about is an example based on race, but of course we know that many other forms of discrimination exist. For example, based on age, gender, sexual orientation, religion, social class, disability status, really any number of other social categories. And across the board, we see that members of these non-dominant groups are disadvantaged. And this happens across all kinds of very important work outcomes. So things like pay, promotions, job prospects, access to training, mentoring opportunities, and really just in the overall treatment and evaluation that they experience from peers and superiors. That, of course, is in addition to just general discrimination in other really important life domains like access to housing or medical care or education. If we think about workplace discrimination, it's easy to see how each of those individual effects that I just told you about, from being blocked from getting callbacks or being mistreated at work or being denied a promotion, all of those effects can add up across people over time, and they end up creating really large disparities in our labor market. What we see at sort of the aggregate level is that groups that have experienced a long history of systemic discrimination tend to have higher rates of unemployment and underemployment. It's really not a level playing field at all. Sadly, this information is nothing new. This isn't something that we're only now becoming aware of. There have been, as I said, decades of research and policy aimed at trying to understand discrimination and to try to reduce it. Unfortunately, there's still so much work that needs to be done, but that's not to say, of course, that people haven't been trying. One of the big trends over the past 30 to 40 years, one of the big efforts that we've seen aimed at solving the problem of discrimination has been the introduction of diversity training programs at work. This type of training can take many different forms, and many of you will probably have participated in some of these training programs yourself. The training programs could include things like teaching about unconscious or implicit bias. It could be things like role-playing interactions with coworkers who look or think or act differently from you. It could include listening to lectures about the business or legal case for diversity. The content is different from program to program, but a major common feature of diversity training, and something that's really important for this webinar, is that most firms that adopt diversity training tend to make the training mandatory. I think many of you who tuned into today's webinar are probably here because you're interested in the concept of nudges. Nudges are indirect, they're subtle. Above all else, they maintain an individual's autonomy and the right to choose. They change behavior, but they do it in a very gentle way. Anything that's mandatory isn't a nudge at all, it's a shove. It's direct, it's strongly enforced, it really disrupts that individual autonomy and choice. Frank Dobbin and Alexander Kalev are two researchers who conducted sort of a systematic analysis of 30 years of data on diversity training programs in over 800 companies. Basically what they found is that mandatory diversity training programs either have no effect or can actually make things worse, especially for Black men and for Asian men and women. What they argue, in line with nudge theory, is that mandatory training has failed because it's human nature to rebel and resist when we feel like we're being forced to do something. In a lot of ways, we're all kind of like toddlers. So if you try to force me to eat my vegetables, I'll probably just end up throwing them all on the floor. But if you give me a choice between carrots and peas, I might try a bit of the peas. The key really is maintaining that choice and the perception of autonomy, even if it's somewhat of an illusion. So if you flip this analysis and look at companies that had voluntary training where people could choose whether or not to attend, Dobbin and Kalev found much better results. When training was voluntary, companies actually saw increases in diversity. They found that the same kind of effects they found these same kinds of effects for other types of diversity programs as well. Any program that they looked at that was more nudge-like, more gentle, maintaining the right to choose, helped to increase diversity, while programs that were more shove-like actually ended up making things worse. So some of you might be wondering, where diversity training programs came from. Why did companies start implementing them in the first place? They're really widespread now, but how did they get started? Many of the diversity programs that we see in organizations today were developed in response to governmental policy oversight. Again, a big shove. On the policy side in the US, starting in the 60s and 70s, we saw the rise of equal employment opportunity and affirmative action. In Canada, our Employment Equity Act was legislated in 1986, most recently amended in 1995. So all of a sudden, with this legislation, it became necessary for organizations to have formalized policies and practices around diversity. One of these practices has been the adoption of formal diversity statements. So just as companies have mission statements or financial statements that they send out to shareholders or release to the public, companies started to write up formal statements about their diversity-related goals and their diversity-related beliefs. Going back to Canada's Employment Equity Act, I would say that the language of the Act really represents Canada's first diversity statement. And the purpose of the Act, as stated, is to correct the conditions of disadvantage in employment experienced by women, Aboriginal people, persons with disabilities, and members of visible minorities. These are the 4 protected groups under this Act. The specifics of this Act govern all federally regulated industries. It's been adopted by most provinces more widely. And since this Act became law, diversity statements have been adopted by the vast majority of companies in Canada. In a survey that I did a few years ago of the top 500 companies in Canada, only 2%, so 10 companies, didn't have diversity statements. So to give you some examples of what I'm talking about, here are some diversity statements. So the University of Toronto has one. At the University of Toronto, we believe that the diversity of our staff, students, and faculty reflects our local and global community. It's a mark of quality and a source of strength. TELUS has one. Our world is rich with diversity. We believe that the diversity of our team is a significant competitive advantage. Air Canada has one. Diversity is greatly valued and essential to the company's success. Each of these organizations up on the slide now is a 2017 winner of Canada's Best Diversity Employers competition, which means that they've demonstrated a real commitment to diversity beyond just these kinds of promotional statements. But what I'm going to show you next is that for many companies, these statements are kind of the first and last word on diversity. It doesn't end up going much beyond this. I recently conducted a research project on these kinds of statements, specifically asking the question of whether these diversity statements translate into real actions. Do the words contained within those diversity statements reflect reality, or are they simply an ideal? So along with my collaborators, Katie DeSalles, Andres Tilchik, and Sora Jun, we set out to test this question in a series of studies. And I'll tell you first about a field experiment that we did. So in our field experiment, we wanted to really directly test the question of whether diversity statements actually mean anything in terms of who gets hired. So will minority applicants actually do better when they're applying for jobs at organizations that really proudly display these diversity statements, or are the diversity statements more just for show? So we did this by creating resumes for Black and Asian applicants that varied in the extent to which racial information was apparent, and we used those to apply for jobs that did or did not mention diversity. So let me walk you through what we did. We created resumes and application materials for applicants from 2 racial groups, Black and Asian. You can see that in that left column. We varied the extent to which race cues were present on the resumes that we created. So either they were completely transparent about race, very obvious to tell what group this applicant is from, or we changed some things to make it harder and harder to tell that the applicants were Black or Asian. We had 4 conditions, which varied the race cues that were present on the resumes, which you see across the top of the table. And that first condition, where there's race cues present in names and experiences, Basically, we use names and experiences which were obviously indicative that the candidate was Black or Asian. So in this example, we used Lamar J. Smith as the Black representative name and Lei Zhang as the Asian representative name. Then we had a whitened first name condition where we changed the first name of applicants to make their race less obvious. So L. James Smith, Luke Zhang. A whitened experience condition where we left names alone but changed the listed experiences so they don't have any racial cues. So for example there, instead of listing involvement in a Black or Asian Students Association, we just listed as Students Association. And finally, condition where we tried to remove the racial cues as much as possible so that both the names and the experiences were whitened. We made sure that the applicants were really highly qualified for the jobs that we were applying for, and then we sent out their resumes to 1,600 different jobs, half of which went to job advertisements for diversity-friendly employers who explicitly said something about diversity, had a diversity statement, and then half of which went to job advertisements that didn't mention diversity at all. We created email accounts and phone numbers for these applicants, and we just wanted to observe how many callbacks they received. And remember, what we were really interested in here is whether those diversity statements actually translate into more diversity-friendly practice when it comes to hiring. Specifically, do our Black and Asian applicants get more callbacks when they apply to those diversity-friendly employers? So I'll show you the results now. I'll show you the results for the Black applicants first. So along the y-axis, which is that vertical axis there, you'll see the percentage, the callback rate. So basically this is the percentage of applications that we sent out that resulted in an invitation for an interview. Along the x-axis or the horizontal axis at the bottom there, you see those whitening conditions. So on the left-hand side, it's very obvious that the applicant is Black. All the way on the right-hand side, now it's impossible to tell that the applicant is Black. They might as well be white. So I'll show you the results for all of the job ads first. Basically, in that condition where it's obvious that the applicant is Black, we got a 10% callback rate. So that was sort of our baseline to which we compared all the other conditions. Once we whiten the name, we got a few more, not significant difference. Once we whiten the experiences, we're up to an 18% callback rate. And once we whiten both names and experiences, now it's impossible to tell that the applicant isn't white. We're up to 25.5%. So you're 2.5 times more likely to get a callback when these employers think that you're white compared to when they know that the applicant is Black. So those were the results for all of the job ads. Now I'm going to show you the results for the subsample of job ads with pro-diversity language. So remember, these are the employers who are telling us, we really value diversity, we're an equal opportunity employer, we want to hire more diverse people. So when we look at that and when we look at those results, the pattern is actually the exact same. So what we see is, again, that when the applicant appears to be white, they're 2.5 times more likely to get a callback than when it's obvious that the applicant is Black. And really what we see here is the more that we whiten those resumes, the better off our applicant is, the more callbacks they receive. What's really striking, again, is that there's no difference between the subsample of job ads that mentioned diversity versus those that did not. And we've observed basically the same pattern of result for our Asian applicants. And the main finding, again, across both of these types of resumes was that the whitened resumes were 2 to 2.5 times more likely to get a callback than the unwhitened resumes where the race is obvious. The most important thing, again, is that the gap was no smaller for those pro-diversity employers than employers who didn't mention diversity at all. So unfortunately, the answer to our research question was no. Similar to the work that I showed you earlier on diversity training programs, diversity statements haven't changed the rate of employment discrimination. We see very clearly here that pro-diversity employers discriminate at similar rates to employers who don't even bother to mention diversity. So we wanted to know next what other effects diversity statements might be having. We knew from other research that diversity statements can have some unexpected effects. So, for example, they can create an illusion of fairness where high status group members sort of legitimize the status quo. They become less sensitive to discrimination because if that statement's in place, then everything must be taken care of. They can create an environment in which people who come forward with discrimination claims are not believed. How can you experience discrimination in a company that has these great values? And they can also create resentment and rebound effects. So we sometimes see higher rates of discrimination after people are exposed to diversity statements or training programs than we saw beforehand. So what we wanted to do is test whether diversity statements also have an effect on applicants themselves. Really, we wanted to know whether diversity statements also sort of create a false sense of security for applicants. So do applicants see these statements and think, hey, this is a safe place for me? And is that going to lead them to not take steps to avoid discrimination that they might have taken otherwise? So we tested this question of what effect diversity statements have on job applicants using a lab experiment. And what we wanted to do here was really precisely measure the effect of diversity statements on job applicants by measuring how transparent they were willing to be with their racial cues in response to job ads that did or didn't mention diversity. And this idea of transparency with cues about one's race was informed by another study that we did, a series of interviews, where we interviewed racial minority university students who were actively applying for jobs. We used the interviews to ask the students about their behavior when applying for jobs, specifically when it came to managing cues that make their race obvious to someone that they're sending their resume out to. What we learned from those interviews was that applicants would sometimes conceal or downplay racial cues in their names or experiences to avoid discrimination because they anticipated experiencing it. And we called this phenomenon resume whitening. And it was really any action that someone might take to downplay or conceal their race when applying for jobs. So some examples of this might be someone with a traditional Chinese name like Ming using the English name Mei on her resume, or someone who has a lot of experience organizing events for their university's Bangladeshi Students Association, for example. They might drop the Bangladeshi qualifier when listing that experience on their resume. A really important piece of information that our interviewees kept on telling us again and again was that even if they knew someone, even if they were someone who regularly whiten their resume, so it's something that they did all the time when they were applying for jobs, they said that they're less likely to do it when they see diversity-friendly language on job ads, the diversity statements that I just told you about. And if we think about psychology behind this, it makes sense. The diversity statements really communicate a norm. They say, hey, this is a safe place. We're not going to discriminate. We love diversity here. And that's a little nudge for minority applicants to be more transparent about their race. So this is what we wanted to confirm with our lab experiment. We did this by getting resumes from study participants before they came to the lab. We just asked them, if you were to apply for a job today, send us the resume that you would send in for that job. And they told us what field they were interested in. Then, a couple weeks later, we had them come into the lab. We gave them an envelope with the resume that they had sent us, along with a one-page job posting relevant to the interest area that they had indicated. Then they were randomly assigned into one of two conditions. So half of participants were assigned to a control condition, where they saw the job ad that they read about, just had a generic statement about a company that valued performance and efficiency and kind of this neutral picture of a puzzle piece with a pencil on top. And then in a diversity condition, participants read about a job with an equal opportunity employer who really values fairness, diversity, justice, and your sort of standard picture of a diverse team there. And then what we asked them to do is just prepare a resume for that specific job. So what we're able to do with this design is really do a nice pre-post here, because we can look at the resumes that participants created in the lab and compare them back to the ones that they had sent us before coming in. Because we randomly assign people to condition here, we can attribute any variance that we see in those resumes to that condition manipulation. So this is just a picture of the job advertisements to show you that it's just a very small, subtle manipulation really we wanted to see if something small like this could nudge applicants to be more transparent with their racial cues. So it's just that little, the change in the description and as well as the little picture that you see there. So let's look at our results. This table shows differences in resume whitening split by employer description. So either the control condition, again with just a generic employee description, or the pro-diversity employer condition. So we see the differences by name, education, experience, but if we just focus in the bottom in the red square, if we look at the percentage of participants who engaged in any form of resume whitening anywhere on their resume, we found that participants were half as likely to whiten in response to job ads that mentioned valuing diversity. So the diversity statements acted as an effective and actually very powerful nudge towards transparency. But if we think about the results of our studies altogether, that's not good news, right? Participants in our interview told us, participants in this lab experiment showed us that they're less likely to whiten when responding to a pro-diversity employer. They're going to use their real names, they're going to be transparent about their experiences. But if you think back to what I told you about our field experiment where we sent out the resumes, you can see that this is not a good idea. The diversity statements have set up this false sense of security for job applicants because those companies end up discriminating at similar rates to employers who don't even mention diversity at all. They really nudge applicants to be open about their minority status in a context where discrimination is widespread. So our research tells us a few things about diversity statements, both in terms of what they mean for companies and how they can impact applicants. The first thing that they tell us is that, the research tells us is that pro-diversity employers also discriminate. We don't see a difference in the rates of discrimination between companies that mention diversity and those that don't. We see that applicants do feel safe to disclose racial cues. They're more transparent when they're applying to those pro-diversity employers. But because of that, diversity statements might actually backfire. They can provide a false sense of security and end up doing more harm than good. So if these diversity statements are encouraging applicants to reveal racial cues to an organization that's going to discriminate against them anyway, they can actually open up minorities to more discrimination. So for some people, the diversity statements can end up having the exact opposite of their intended effect. I think something that's important to consider when you're thinking about, what this research means is to think about how visible your diversity statement is. Your company probably has a diversity statement, just like the University of Toronto, that's seen by anyone who goes to our website, anyone who applies for a job here. It's really highly visible. It's a salient cue, which is actually having these effects. And so we have to be careful to make sure that those diversity statements are actually backed up by some change in our policies and practices so that we're actually living up to the expectations that we're creating with those statements. So you're probably wondering, why does this happen? Why would companies bother, right? Why do they make efforts to put diversity statements out, put them into place, and then not make sure that they're following through and turning those words into actions? And this puzzle, I think, becomes a lot clearer once we think about this in terms of psychology and in terms of behavioral science more generally speaking. I think a lot of this has to do with human nature, the limitations of the human brain to process large amounts of information without relying on things like stereotypes and prejudices. What's happening is that we're seeing really a disconnect between our attitudes and our behaviors. So the values and the attitudes that we hold really dear are often very difficult to enact or translate into behavior. The ways that we want to act are often quite different from the way that we actually end up acting. And I think one of the reasons that this is happening in this domain is because making decisions about who to hire is extremely complex. It requires a lot of attention, and there's a lot of different factors to consider. We have to make these really quick heuristic decisions under all kinds of different pressure. So we have things like time pressure, resource pressure, social conformity pressure, and just so much information. There's information overload. And under any of those circumstances, we're likely to really fall back into unconscious or implicit or unintentional biases. I think that, any of you who are listening who have experience with hiring know what I mean when I'm talking about information overload. You might have a file of 50 or 100 or 500 resumes to go through, and it's hard work. And so our brains are programmed very effectively to make hard work easier by using shortcuts. And stereotypes about women or men or older adults or Indian people, at their core, they're just these kinds of mental shortcuts. They're just there to help us out. And another reason I think that we're seeing these effects is because, like the mandatory diversity training programs, diversity statements might present a threat to the individual autonomy of recruiters and hiring managers. So while the statements might act as nudges for applicants, signaling to them that this is a safe place to be transparent about their identities, for hiring managers who have to abide by these statements, the statements can be more of a shove and perhaps too heavy-handed to be effective. So what can we do? I'm going to end my talk with some ideas informed by social psychology and behavioral economics that might help us to take diversity from these kinds of words that we see into action. So some ideas for how we can nudge for diversity. All of the suggestions I'll provide for nudging for diversity make use of what we know about human psychology and behavior, and I hope that they'll provide some food for thought. I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback, your questions, either in the chat box that Patrick talked about or even afterwards via Twitter or email. The first suggestion that I have is one of the fundamental principles of behavioral science, measurement. And the suggestion here is just to adopt a data-driven approach to designing interventions in policy, which we don't often see when it comes to things like diversity. The famous axiom here is that we can't fix what we don't measure. In terms of hiring, this means that you need to know what's going on at every stage. You need to know what's going on at hiring, what's going on in promotion, what's going on in tenure. You have to be able to identify problem areas. A great example of this is here at the University of Toronto. We just started this year to collect race information from incoming students. This information, I think, will be really beneficial in identifying underrepresentation, identifying groups to target for specific recruitment. Without that measurement, we simply don't know where to begin, right? We're just kind of taking shots in the dark. We need to know where to start. In my research, I've tried to do a lot of work with companies who seem very eager at the beginning, then they shy away once they realize that change requires a lot of experimentation. We can't know what's going to work in advance. We have to experiment and test things out and make more changes after that. It's really an iterative process. So the advice here, I think, is don't be afraid to change things a little at a time. You have to be able to do pilot studies, really think like a scientist, be rigorous in measurement, design really careful manipulations, measure the results. If you're happy, apply that more broadly. See what happens. If you're not happy, try something else. Don't get fixated on the idea that you can only implement something once you have the perfect solution that you can uniformly apply across your organization, because it won't happen. Goals and measurement also introduce public accountability, which I think is great. Things like what's wrong, what we're going to do about it, how we're going to fix it, whether or not that's working, become part of the collective consciousness. What's public, what's visible, and what's measured are more likely to get attention and more likely to change. Another great concept that we can make use of from behavioral science is that of opt-outs and defaults. So it turns out that inertia is a huge motivating or demotivating force in human behavior. The classic finding being that defaults are very sticky. People are unlikely to move away from a default unless they have a very strong, compelling reason to do so. One example of this is research on organ donation, which you may have heard about 2 webinars ago with Nico. So in some countries like Germany, organ donation is determined using an opt-in system. So the default is that you're not an organ donor unless you take action to opt in by filling out and sending in a form. In other countries like Austria, organ donation is determined using an opt-out system. So the default is that everyone is an organ donor unless you take that action to opt out. So in Germany, where the default is that you're not an organ donor, only around 12% of people take the action to opt in. In Austria, where the default is that everyone is an organ donor, 99% of people remain organ donors. Very few people actually opt out. Across all kinds of decisions, most of which are less serious than organ donorship, the finding is still that defaults matter. When the desired action is the default with the option to opt out, very few people actually exercise that option. They never lose their autonomy to do so, but it's just much, much less likely. So this can be applied to some of the problems we see around promotion and participation of women and minorities at work. For example, if we just think about women for a moment, we know that women are less likely to do things like apply for promotions, to seek out mentors, to take on leadership roles, even something like speaking up at meetings. So why not make these desired actions default? When it comes time for promotion, let all eligible employees know that they're being considered, provide the option to opt out. You'll likely end up with many more women in the pool than if they had to make that active choice to apply. You can also make access to a formal mentor the default, again, allowing people to opt out if they want to, but few likely will. Similarly, you could try to make speaking up at meetings or taking on leadership roles default as well. So, for example, you could give everyone at a meeting 3 minutes to communicate their ideas, allowing people, again, to opt out if they have nothing to say, or creating project teams and then cycling people through the leadership position, again, making opting out an option. My next suggestion is to eliminate the disconnect between attitudes and behaviors using something called scenario planning or behavioral guidelines. People often have very strong attitudes or values, but don't know how to implement them behaviorally. Famous psychologist Peter Goldwasser, his research has found that adopting implementation intentions is a really reliable technique for translating goals into actions. So an implementation intention is just a planned response to a hypothetical scenario. So they usually take a really simple form, something like whenever situation X happens, I initiate the behavior Y. Implementation intentions can help people act in alignment with their values because the appropriate response has been identified in advance. I think a lot of the inaction around discrimination that we see in others, in ourselves, is really rooted in uncertainty. People know that discrimination is wrong. They don't like it, but they don't know what they're supposed to do to stop it. So, if you hear a colleague making a biased comment in a committee meeting, what are you supposed to say? If you see gendered language in a reference letter, how can you call this out effectively? So if we develop really clear behavioral guidelines for promoting diversity, you need to do it obviously in a way that's unique to your particular industry, to your organization, but provide more structure and certainty than attitudinal guidelines, which really just tell people how they're supposed to think about things. We know from research on goal setting, for example, by one of my colleagues just down the hall here at UT, Gary Latham, that we have to be very specific about goals. Telling someone, for example, to do their best on a test is much less effective than telling them to aim to score 80% or higher. Likewise, we can't just set an abstract diversity goal without a concrete plan to achieve it. So my suggestion is to check out a company like Bias Interrupters, which has toolkits and training programs for organizations and individuals which are behavioral in nature. They have concrete behavioral prescriptions. They really take the guesswork out of how to deal with bias when you see it, which I think is a huge deterrent to action. The next suggestion is to rethink and really restructure the interview process. The most common selection mechanism for hiring right now is an unstructured interview, a technique which everyone knows is really vulnerable to bias. One of the most pervasive forms of bias that rears its head in these situations is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias focuses our attention on information that supports our pre-existing beliefs. So let's say, pretend for a moment that you're interviewing candidates for a job as a kindergarten teacher. Okay, so imagine yourself in that situation. Imagine the candidates that you're interviewing. What do they look like? Many of you probably imagined a group of young women because many of us hold the stereotype that women are better at childcare. So now what happens when a man comes in to interview for that job? We're more likely to selectively notice aspects of his behavior, his responses, that confirm our own belief that he's not right for the job. So when hiring managers conduct unstructured interviews, they have nothing to go on other than these kinds of pre-existing beliefs, their subjective feelings about a candidate, and this is prime time for bias to creep in. The worst thing is that hiring managers believe that they're exceptional judges of character and merit, despite this huge body of research that shows the opposite. So we need to shift the default here, make interviews much more about objective evaluations and really minimize opportunities for subjective evaluations about abstract things to come into it. So an option here is to use structured interviews, have specific detailed questions, allow each candidate the same amount of time to answer each question. It's one way to go about this. But really the best way, I think, is to minimize how much you're relying on interviews and replace them with skills-based assessment. So if you're hiring, let's say, a computer programmer, you're going to learn a lot more about how good they are for the job by getting them to code something for you than by asking them to tell you about their strengths and weaknesses or to tell you about a time at work that they demonstrated innovative leadership. You need to see the skills. That's what you're hiring for. My next suggestion is to remove cues which may activate biases, like those related to race or gender or social class. This is known as anonymized recruitment, and it's been hugely successful in reducing disparities in a variety of contexts around the world. When people are looking through applications, they're exposed to lots of extraneous information. We simply don't need that information to determine who's best for the job. The information, things like names, or sometimes people have addresses, the schools where they got their education. The information activates stereotypes, and they're completely unrelated to job performance. So if we take this information away by anonymizing applications, we alter the structure of the choice environment so that people are less likely to get hung up on these irrelevant details like race or gender. There are a bunch of great tools out there to help you to try this out in your own job searches. So for example, you can try a tool like Unbiased, which automatically anonymizes LinkedIn profiles by removing pictures, by removing names. You can work with Applied, which is a great company that anonymizes applications for you and shares them across independent reviewers to take out some of the bias. Applied can also help you to conduct skills interviews, skills assessments actually, that I just talked about, so that you don't have to rely on credentials alone. There are a lot of tools out there, those are just two, to help you really become a choice architect, to change the way that you receive information about candidates. You should be in control of that, right? Don't just let the information overwhelm you. Related to this point, also think about how applicant order effects might impact our decision making. So people are more likely to pay attention to the first and last information that they receive, which is known as primacy and recency bias. Most application management systems that I've seen are structured so that the very first piece of information that you receive is someone's name. And it's so salient. You have to double click on someone's name to open their resume. Right at the top of that, it's their name again. It's hugely salient. But again, irrelevant to a hiring decision. These things can be changed. The next point I want to talk a little bit about are the concepts of fluency and exposure. So through my research, through a lot of research that's been done looking at the effects of names, those findings tell us again and again that ethnic minority names tend to prompt discrimination. And I think that a lot of this discrimination is likely related to fluency issues. So it's just that these names are difficult to pronounce by those who are unfamiliar with the language. We also see that people with difficult to pronounce names in any language tend to be liked less. So even someone living in Canada with an English name that's a little bit hard to pronounce might experience worse outcomes than someone who has an English name that's very easy to say. So I think that we can do a lot more in terms of fluency and exposure to these different types of names. I think we can provide training on how to pronounce common names and phonemes in languages that are relevant to your applicant population. Everyone in Toronto, should have access to the types of names that are familiar in the applicant pool here. We should know how to have a rough idea of how to say those names. We can also have applicants record names, submit audio in their applications, or even just include phonetic spelling of their names on resumes to make things easier. I've heard from a lot of different hiring managers who say that, they'd be willing to consider an applicant, but they're embarrassed about making that phone call because they don't want to say the person's name incorrectly. Again, it's about uncertainty, right? And so if we become more fluent, we make it easier, this helps to sort of combat that human aversion to uncertainty. When we encounter things that we don't understand, we don't recognize, we feel anxious, we want to go back to something more familiar, a name that you know how to say. So the more familiar we are with different names, the more comfortable we'll be. The less likely we'll be to have that negative knee-jerk reaction. And as a bonus, I think, pronouncing someone's name correctly makes them feel better too, and it goes a long way toward creating a culture of inclusion. Another important idea from behavioral science is the impact of norms. Norms are these conventional patterns of behavior that are considered acceptable by a social group. A big part of human behavior is based on imitating the people around us. When we change our perceptions of what everyone else believes, that can also change our behavior. A really good example of this, I think, is from the UK Behavioral Insights team. They looked at the effects of changing perceived norms on tax payment. So they sent out 100,000 notices to UK citizens who were late in paying their taxes. The most effective ones were the ones that singled people out as being in the minority for being late with their taxes. So because we're naturally social species, we don't want to feel like we aren't living up to these normative standards of our group. So this means that if everyone in an organization appears to value diversity, we're more likely to value diversity ourselves. If it becomes a norm, if it's considered normative to express prejudicial attitudes or engage in discriminatory behavior, which is a huge conversation now in the US, these practices will become sort of embedded within the social environment. So thankfully, there's a lot of different ways to change perceived norms within social groups. The most important one being from group leaders. The behavior of people at the top of the group have a powerful influence on the people below. So if you find yourself in a high power position, just demonstrating the behavior that you want goes a long way. Finally, related to changing perceived norms, I'd like to propose, that we continue or start in some cases to talk really openly about diversity and discrimination. Expose yourself, others to research on discrimination and bias to facilitate really educated changes and choices. Be a champion for diversity and inclusion, especially, like I said, if you're in a high power position. This is related to another bias, the availability bias. If we just sweep all of our experiences as discrimination under the rug, it's going to be really impossible for people to bring up experiences of discrimination to mind when they think about it. That's going to lead them to think that discrimination isn't really a problem. If I can't think of an example, it must not exist. Then, due to confirmation bias, you're going to be less likely to notice it when it does happen as well. So, just to sum up, I think diversity has been a very important goal of organizations, like I said, for at least the past 30 years, probably longer. And a lot of the work that we've done has been around these sort of mission statements and plans and equity principles, but unfortunately we haven't seen a lot of movement with these words. It hasn't led to a lot of real change. So I think if we want to really get serious about diversity, it's time to really think about moving those words to action by testing out these specific behavioral and structural solutions. So that's it for me. Thanks again for your time and attention, and I'll turn it over to Patrick now so I can hear some of your questions.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Sonia. So I have been monitoring the chat box, and so feel free to keep asking questions during the start of this Q&A session. We'll likely only have time for about 2, maybe 3. So the first question I have is one about measurement, actually. So Jacqueline writes, declaring ethnicity in job applications in the U.S. is optional. Moreover, there are some people who believe that they declare they're Caucasian or white, they stand a lesser chance of going to the next stage, say in an interview. And so in your research or in research that you know, how do you overcome this in measurement?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I've seen this in my own research as well. So we have the same kind of voluntary declaration here in Canada, and a lot of times we see people they are not sure about what the motivation is. So again, it's an uncertainty thing, right? They're not sure. It seems a little bit threatening, is this going to help me? Is it going to hurt me? And so a lot of times we'll see people either choosing not to fill that out, or they'll fill it out incorrectly. So in some of the research that I've done where people have to say whether or not they're a visible minority, for example, if we look at their names, we would say, obviously, this is someone who we're thinking about when we're thinking about, who should be checking this box, but they're not checking it. And I think a lot of that can be overcome if you're able to provide really clear and concrete examples of how declaring your status will help you and not hurt you. So I think, putting onto, if, for example, on your job application software or before that, if you can have examples, testimonials from people who work in the company talking about the inclusive environment, thinking about, how you actually use that information to bring people into the company and not block people out, I think that just clears up that uncertainty. So you really need to be transparent about how you're using it and how you've used it in the past. If you have used it in the past, if this is your first go about, just be honest about what your intentions are.
Great. This is a question more specific about the experimental design.
Okay.
White resume paper. So the question is, how did you as experimenters make sure that the people screening these resumes didn't see, say, two? So how there wasn't necessarily cross-contamination between the conditions?
Yeah, so in terms of that, we made sure that each company only received one resume. So we were really careful about that across different regions as well. So we did it across a number of different cities. So if you received a resume to your company in one city, you wouldn't receive it in that same city or any other city either. So we just made sure that they only got one.
Great. And I guess this is our last question, a great question. So beyond the skills that are key for any role, many, if not all companies, want to select people who fit the quote-unquote culture and values of their company. We know that these assessments of culture and fit and values can be fraught with discrimination and biases. So in your opinion, what would you suggest in terms of behavioral science changes to address these sorts of issues?
Yeah, so I think on this question, one of the things that's really important is to determine with a large group of people in your company, a diverse group of people, what is your culture? Sometimes when people are hiring, they want to find people that fit in with their individual understanding of what culture is. And so that's where we run into things like bias and discrimination. But if you're truly inclusive in gaining a sense of what the culture of your company is, so you have, really large like town halls, try to get a sense of what the culture is, what the culture means to everyone. As long as you're being representative about what your culture is, I think that it's okay to think about things like fit. You just want to make sure that that concept of fit is not coming from one particular person or one particular type of person. It's definitely, these social interactions are common at work, obviously. They're important to have, but you want to make sure that the idea of fit is something that's shared by the group. It's not just something that's coming from one person or one group of people.
Great. Okay. That's actually all the questions we have. Again, we'd like to thank Sonia for leading our webinar today.
Thanks.
A recording of this webinar will be available at our website by clicking the side tab labeled Events and then clicking the sub-tab labeled Bear Webinar Series. Our next webinar will be December 7th. It'll be the last one of 2017. And we will hear from Dina Gromit, who's a research fellow from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, whose research investigates how people's values affects their judgment and choices, and how people react to wrongdoing, and how people perceive whether justice was delivered in various situations. That promises to be a very interesting seminar. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Sonia, again for
Thanks, everyone.
And you can now exit this webinar by closing your WebEx screen.